Part 1. Listen to the rest of this story on our channel. Also on our channel, you will find many other stories about expeditions and discoveries. Please subscribe and like our videos so that other people can know about them. Thank you very much. Alexander Evgenievich Fersman. Journeys for Stone. From the author. For 40 years of my scientific activity, I had to travel all over our country and visit its most diverse regions. From the shores of the Polar Ocean to the forest expanses of Pechora Palma and the dry subtropics of the Persian border. There were years when I had to do up to 60,000 kilometers. There were years when most of the time had to be spent by car, on long routes of caravans, or in long wanderings on foot through the swamps and tundra of the Kola Peninsula. When the publishing house asked me to write a book about my expeditions, I took it up with pleasure. But, as always happens with an enthusiastic author, I very soon departed from the strictly outlined plan. Memories from the fog of the distant past began to be clothed in real images. Some expeditions logically followed from others, the individual links of the Urals, the Altai, the Crimea, the polar countries. The islands of the Mediterranean Sea began to merge into a single chain, and to tear out individual moments from it would mean to forcibly remove any paint from the variegated picture of the past, and going further and further in my memories, pulling myself up along the chain of impressions. I wanted to simply and guilelessly tell how I began to be interested in stone. How I moved from a simple collection of minerals and rocks to large scientific research expeditions. To tell how my love for stone was born, turning into the main stimulus of my life. How gradually the abstract interest in stone began to be transformed into the study of the productive forces of our country and the great problems of industry and economy on the new routes of construction. Filled this love with new content, creating a new stimulus of a public, social nature. The search for stone for his own collection resulted in the collection of stone for the State Museum, and the expeditions turned into long epics of the struggle for the possession of the stone. For its use, small mineralogical problems grew into huge industrial problems of a general national and world scale. Individual links in the chain of memories led from playing with polished stones on the shores of the Black Sea to the creation of new cities, to the discovery of new industrial areas. These new links were born in a new historical and psychological environment, but still they were inextricably linked with the first childhood experiences. At the sight of a sparkling brush of hematite in the window of a store, with an almost sacred awe that seized me at the marble columns of the Parthenon in Athens, and I decided to write the history of this chain of experiences, thoughts, pictures of the past. Almost 50 years, half a century between the final links of this chain. But the sharper and deeper is the sharp line between the past and the future. I wanted to write a simple book for young people about my travels, but I wrote rather the story of my love for stone, the history of some of the great conquests of modern mineralogy and geochemistry. I am not afraid of a certain dominance of the historical element in my book. I am deeply convinced that the present can be well understood only by knowing the past, that it is possible to fight for the future only by taking into account the successes and mistakes of the paths traveled. The historical course of the development of the natural sciences in recent years proves this to us at every step. New ideas, revolutionarily breaking the old boring schemes of our sciences, came as an inevitable consequence of the historical course of development of thought and science in the 19th century. At the boundaries of descriptive disciplines, crystallography, mineralogy, physics and chemistry, geography and astronomy, new generalizing theories were born. Bold creative thought connected individual phenomena and facts of nature with new threads, and from this connection was born that new science, which does not simply enumerate the objects around us, but establishes the laws of their connection, the laws of their mutual transformation and change. The nature that surrounds us has become for us the source not only of the greatest experiences, but also of the greatest scientific syntheses, and those paintings of the great geographers of the 18th and 19th centuries, which were masterfully embodied by Alexander Humboldt in his famous Cosmos, cannot satisfy us now. In our wanderings, in our observation of nature, we are now looking for the laws of its development. The colorful carpet of Altai flowers tells us not only about the smells and colors of these flowers, but also about the laws of absorption of light waves. The black basalt covers of Siberia speak of its geological past, of the greatest pictures of fluctuations and faults of the ancient shields of the earth, and bright yellow accumulations of sulfur in the deserts of Central Asia give rise to new ideas for their economic use. We don't want to be photographers of nature, the earth and its riches. We want to be researchers, creators of new ideas. We want to be conquerors of nature, fighters for its subordination to man, his culture and his economy. We don't want to be mere accurate observers, dispassionate tourists writing down their impressions in a notebook. We want to deeply experience the pictures of nature. We want not only a thought, but also a deed to be born from a deep, thoughtful experience. We cannot just walk around the vast expanses of our motherland. We must be participants in its reconstruction and creators of a new life. Such are our ideas, wherever we are. In the sands of the Catacombs, among extinct volcanoes and hot springs, in the mines of the southern Urals, and on the pages of this book, I want to convey these ideas, these experiences, this fascination with nature to those who love their country, who are burning with the desire to merge in a single impulse for its future. But at the same time, I wanted to give the reader knowledge of the facts and the phenomena themselves. I wanted, as far as possible, to really acquaint him with the countries and regions about which I write. I wanted the reader not to forget that facts for a scientist are the same as the air on which the wings of a bird rest during flight. As Academician Ivan Petrovich Pavlov so beautifully told young people, I wrote this book at different times, under different conditions, and in different moods. I have also used some of my old articles, pamphlets, and descriptions for it. I was not afraid of differences in style, approach, mood, since this was precisely what met one of the most important conditions of the book, its sincerity. Before the big expeditions, Crimea, it's been more than 50 years since I started working with stones. I remember the first vivid impressions of the enchanting Crimea, the first childhood experiences. We spent the summer near Simferopol, in an old landowner's house, surrounded by slender rows of fruit trees. Behind the garden rose the dry, sun-scorched mountain peaks of the northern Crimea. Not far from home, on a small rocky hill, we, cheerful children, spent whole days crawling along the rocks, going down to a slowly flowing river with small turtles in it. For hours we sat on the stones, now wishing to lure green lizards, now picking out grains of various stones with a small penknife from dense sandstone, with feldspar, arcosa. And then one day we discovered a vein of rock crystal on this rock, then another, a third, a whole network of quartz veins cut through the spotted rock. And from the cracks we managed to extract wonderful, transparent as glass, cut into regular hexagonal pyramids crystals of rock crystal. We looked closely at how these crystals sat on the walls of thin sinuous veins, how they rested their point against another wall that hindered their growth. Our talyanchiks carried our imagination into some fairy tale world that we could not understand. We built whole legends, connecting them with the tales of the 1001 Nights. And in our imagination, we pictured somewhere in the depths, behind unknown doors, underground caves with huge crystals of sparkling gems. We were looking for the Aladdin's lamp that would open the door to these riches. And many times in our childhood fascination, we repeated the famous words of the Persian fairy tale, "Sesame, open." With a mysterious look we brought our stones home. The elders approved of our hobby. In the evenings, They no longer told us mysterious tales, but stories from the science of mineralogy, which is still far from being accessible to us. And my strict uncle, a chemist, took us to his laboratory, where he showed us various salts and their crystals. For many years in a row, we were occupied by our mountain near Simferopol. Another time, we went to explore the attic of an old manor house. One of the guys said that there was a treasure, and probably an enchanted one. It was mysterious and enigmatic in the attic. Large rainbow nets, woven by spiders, hung between the rafters. A pigeon escaped from under our feet. The noise of its wings frightened us so much that we stood there without saying a word. "Here it is, the treasure!" we shouted enthusiastically at once and rushed to a large box covered with a fluffy layer of dust. Yes, it was a real treasure, a large collection of stones. We carried it down, washed it, cleaned it, and proudly attached it to our lenses. In this collection, we noticed several very simple, rough stones, such as there were many everywhere round. Previously, we did not collect them and were not even interested in them at all. They were such simple stones, not like our crystals. But on these simple pieces of stone were pasted some small numbers, and on a piece of paper with the collection were written names. I remember how amazed we were. Even simple stones have their own name. But the years passed. 6-year-old children grew up, prepared for school, became independent. We were already looking beyond our hill, and behind a large field of tobacco, we discovered a second wonderful deposit. It was a small ravine, at the bottom of which lay peculiar round stones. They were washed away by rains from clay shales. These stones of a strange, bizarre shape were covered with small pimples. Sometimes they also contained the remains of shells. We were very proud of this discovery for many years. I will not hide the fact that this really wonderful place has remained unexplored to this day, and our round minerals, resembling wild chestnut in shape, which we correctly called markasitics at that time, still remain mysterious to me. As children, it was a mystery that we burned and lived. And here again we pictured some underground treasures from the fairy tales of the 1,001 Nights. My passion for minerals grew every year. At the age of 10 or 12, I wandered all day long in the vicinity of our dacha. From the high balcony one could see a long white strip of the South Coast Highway. At night, the creak of heavy Tatar carts drawn by oxen could be heard from it, and in the mornings, at 9 o'clock sharp, a milepost passed on the highway, a carriage drawn by 4 horses, bringing mail to the southern coast of the Crimea. And every morning, we went out on the highway to get the mail dropped to us from the milepost. And the highway became a new mineralogical paradise for us. It was repaired every year. Stones brought here from small quarries were laid in long stacks, and workers with large hammers broke blocks of stone into rubble. There were so many stones here: variegated limestones and marbles, volcanic dark rocks, beautiful jasper with streaks of agates. It is difficult even to imagine a more variegated and wonderful picture. We carefully collected the fragments of these stones, brought them home, and eagerly listened to the contradictory opinions of our elders, who called our jewels differently. And we wanted to go further, to where this stone was brought from, to that distant quarry, about which the elders told us, and from which the stone was transported to the pavements of Simferopol itself. These were Kerch, an old settlement of Ukrainians exiled here by Catherine E for disobedience. There, in the middle of the steppes, rose a mountain that seemed to be almost half cut by a huge quarry. We visited this place many times, maybe 20 to 30 times in a row, as adult gymnasium students, with a backpack on our backs. We visited this wonderful quarry more than once, which gave so many beautiful minerals to the museums of the Soviet Union. Here, in the cracks of the hard volcanic stone, lay sheets of natural stone cardboard, washed out by surface waters. The threads of this extraordinary Crimean mineral were stretched out in delicate fibers. We collected it in pounds and loaded it onto a small cart drawn by a pair of horses. To the surprise of the workers who helped us in loading, we carefully wrapped the most valuable species in paper, and at home we arranged an exhibition on a large table. Even the elders were amazed at this stone and could not come up with a name for it. More than 20 years have passed since this discovery, and in a thick book published by the Academy of Sciences in 1913 under a long, hard-to-remember title, I first described this remarkable stone, including it in the group of Palygorskite. But in our childhood years, it was just stone cardboard for us, and we were interested in it as much as the thin, brittle needles of lublanite, the bright green crystals of epidote, the beautiful pink intergrowths of welshite, the green crusts of prehnite. How many new names, new minerals, new curiosities the Kerches have given us? We worked there according to a certain plan. We studied and examined every piece of the rock as a favorite part of the garden. The eye got used to the relationships of colors, the rarest details of the structure, the thinnest veins, the smallest crystals. We even tried to sketch these natural resources. In our drawings, they came out grandiose. The crystals grew into wondrous crystal brushes, and everything became incredibly large, beautiful, and bright. Our imagination was strengthened by everything that nature itself gave. But further and further, we went into the mountains of the Crimea. Small children's walks gradually turned into excursions, and one of these excursions we made to the banks of the Olma River, where, as we were told, real ancient volcanoes came to the surface of the earth near the village of Sably. It was a long way to go. We got horses, prepared for the trip for weeks, and again a peculiar world of stone opened up before us, now in the form of greenish layers of a strange mineral, which soaked and was called keel, then in the form of zeolite crystals in the voids of ancient lavas, and around in yellow sandy rocks. Our imagination was struck by a variety of shells. These were the remains of ancient seas inhabited by monsters that had died out long ago. At home, we anxiously turned the pages of fishes, geology and Neumaier's history of the earth, comparing our shells with the images of the mollusks of the ancient seas. Thus, little by little, we began to collect a collection of minerals. Later, my friends developed other hobbies, and I became the sole owner of the entire collection. And the collection grew and grew every year. I asked all my acquaintances to bring me stones from other places, and I looked with envy at the beautiful minerals lying on the shelf or desk of my acquaintances, and often immodestly begged for them for myself. One day my father took us for a walk to the remains of the Genos fortresses, to the very top of the mountain. The ascent through beautiful oak forests was long and tiring, and the sun was already setting when we reached the very top. In the south, the Chenil of Chatterdag is the palette mountain of the Crimean Yala. There, we were told, huge caves cut into the thickness of ancient limestone. In the north, a chalk ridge separated us from the fertile plain of the northern Crimea, and in the west, far, far away, a bright strip glittered, illuminated by the rays of the setting sun. Guys, do you know what it is? Father told us. This is Pontus Euxinus, the hospitable sea of the ancient Greeks, and in Russian the Black Sea. In thought, I returned home. The Black Sea, but there must be stones near it. And during a long period of youthful wanderings, I really got acquainted with the stones of the Black Sea shores near Odessa, Sevastopol with the white rocks of the street, George Monastery with the wonderful minerals of Koktebel, Feodosia, Kerch. I remember that near Odessa, I was interested not so much in those minerals that are occasionally found in the limestones of the coast itself, but in very peculiar deposits of overseas stones near the port and lingering far in ships that came to the port of Odessa for bread, usually through stone ballast, out of their holds. A wide variety of hard rocks from Italy, Spain, South America and even Australia were broken by waves, rolled in and carried ashore by the sea wave in the form of pebbles. Here it was possible to collect a number of interesting rocks that had nothing to do with the Odessa coast itself. I was also greatly impressed by the variegated coctable pebbles, or, as they are sometimes called here, Furliampixes. They have been known for more than 100 years and they are quite small pebbles. In the 6th century, even mosaic tabletops with a peculiar pattern were made of them. The entire coast from Coctable to Otus is adjacent to the foot of an ancient underwater volcano, the famous Karadag. The surf of the sea waves, eroding the coastal cliffs composed of volcanic tuffs, breccias and conglomerates, washes away inclusions of multicolored chalcedony, carnelian, agate and jasper. The same waves turn them into beautiful, rounded pebbles and bring them ashore. The Black Sea attracted me with its steep shores and wonderful sandbanks. Here, in the sand, after the wave receded, it was easy to collect minerals and admire the variegated pattern of shells. In Sevastopol, in the aquarium of the biological station, we could observe not only various monsters inhabiting the Black Sea, but also examine the black silt that lines the depths of the Black Sea, over a vast area of several thousand square kilometers. We were also attracted by the salt lakes with their strong brine and black mud at the bottom. Even now the memories of the old Sochi resort, where I was taken for treatment, are still alive. They smeared me with black sticky mud and washed it off with strong salted brine. In a large old saddle, harnessed by 4 horses, we went to Sochi and Yevpatoria, admiring the southern tornadoes, as if closing the earth and sky with a solid column. We admired the mountains of white and pink salt extracted from salt lakes. 20 years later, I again visited the then elegant resort of Sochi, and this time not as a patient, but as a young scientist sent here to study that peculiar crust of crystals that grew above the Sochi mud as a continuous bumpy cover. Carefully crawling along the elastic surface of this gypsum crust, I then collected a wonderful collection of peak-sharp crystals, of which this crust was composed, and which gradually grew, increasing annually by almost 1 millimeter. I noticed black streaks inside these crystals. It turned out that they, like the annual rings of trees, marked the change of seasons, dusty winter and sunny summer. By these black stripes, I was able to establish the chronology of Sochi Lake. The crystals told me that they were only 12 or 14 years old, that 8 years ago it had been a cold summer and the crystal had hardly grown, and that 2 or 3 years ago the summer weather had lasted a long time, and therefore the crystal had grown in the form of a pure, transparent arrow. This is how the natural stone told its story, and with great interest I collected these letters of nature about the past fates of Sochi Lake. As a result, I wrote a work on the geological and mineralogical study of this lake. Each piece of the wondrous coast washed by the Black Sea was fraught with its own mineralogical mysteries. Here is Sevastopol limestone with liquid drops of incomprehensible mercury. Here are the marbles of the Crimean Yala, variegated in combination of their pink, grey, yellow and reddish tones, partially used to decorate the Moscow metro. And here are the beautiful agate veins in the dark green volcanic rocks of Karadag. And next to it, in a small sackler stuck to the rock, in his grinding workshop at a small loom, the strange figure of a dry Czech Jaromir Tihanik, cutting beautiful stones for rings and various jewelry. Here are long icicles of stalactites hanging from the ceiling of dark, mysterious caves. In the Crimea, there were also silvery crystalline coatings of white nacre or dark, almost black crystals of zinc blend, crystals of golden pyrite, and bright yellow deposits of compounds of the rare metal cadmium greenokites whole or veins. In ancient molten rocks, which were then written about in the newspapers, and we dreamed of a whole mine of zinc and cadmium, lead and silver. It is impossible to count all that Crimea gave us in these unforgettable years of youth. When under the southern sun everything was so beautiful and joyful. When the whole world seemed full of mysteries and secrets. And among them the biggest and most interesting was the mystery of the stone. Many years have passed since then. In 1916, I again had to visit the shores of the Black Sea. It was a difficult time. The First World War was raging. At that time, I was already a young scientist and was a member of a special commission sent to inspect the Kerch mines. Now we faced other tasks. It was no longer just a collection of minerals, not a simple inspection of iron ore deposits. Responsible decisions were ahead. How to use these natural resources? What are the new productive forces of this part of the Crimean Peninsula? We visited the famous mines with billions of tons of iron ore. The wonderful crystals of blue vivianite only interested us as specimens of fine minerals. They told us of the high phosphorus content of this iron ore and made us think about its metallurgy. But now we drove around this part of the Crimea, not on foot with a knapsack on our shoulders, but in a car. We visited the famous Kerch mud volcanoes. This time we were concerned not with the mysterious problem of the origin of these remarkable formations of our country, which have not yet been solved, not with the mystery of the depths from which they rose, but with a purely practical problem that arose before the country at that time, and connected with the extraction of boric acid and borax from the waters of these mud volcanoes. We saw small sedimentation tanks in which boron salts, so necessary for Russia in those years, crystallized. We followed with interest the powerful gas emissions that outlined this new, then still incomprehensible energy force of our country. Having finished exploring all these riches, we drove to the sulfur mine, picturesquely located on the Black Sea coast. Already approaching the mine, I was delighted to see that right in front of it in the open sea lies Zelkonkaya, a wild bare rock, about which Swiss wrote in one of the volumes of his classic work The Face of the Earth, and which was once explored by the geologist Andrusov. There were fantastic stories about this mountain, that it was the remnant of the bridge that once connected the Crimea and the Caucasus. Early in the morning, after inspecting the mine, the mining engineer and I decided to go by boat to inspect this rock. Several sailors of the military detachment stationed on the coast provided us with their boat and quickly drove us to the rocky limestone. We enjoyed the view of the Crimean mountains from it, carelessly admired the foam and spray of the waves hitting the rock, and only when we got back into the boat did we realize that we had fallen into a trap. A strong coastal wind drove the wave into the open sea. The boat was flooded. Leaks were found on all sides. We could hardly scoop out the water, and the ever-increasing wind drove us into the open sea. The situation became more and more terrible. The mining engineer and I exchanged separate phrases, becoming more and more convinced that our 6 sailors could not cope with the wave that was overtaking us. Something had to be done. The boat was already largely flooded. I decided that it was necessary to act, and, pointing out to the sailors the danger of the situation, I said that only by some united, common impulse could we save our lives. I offered an experienced mining engineer to be our boss, and I sat down at the bottom of the boat to scoop out the water. We all set to work together. The engineer successfully steered the boat under the protection of the coastal cliff, and after 2 hours of desperate struggle, we were on the shore. Fatigue and nervous tension were so great that when many of us got ashore, we immediately fell asleep on the warm sand. It was the last evening of my stay in Kerch. We spent it on the shore of the Kerch Strait, admiring the wondrous beauty of the autumn Crimean night. The lights of fishermen's huts burned on the banks. Somewhere in the north, Kerch shone with a continuous glow. The sea, splashing quietly near the shore of Kamish-Burin, glowed with autumn phosphoric light. We said goodbye to Crimea, discussed its future and, together with local engineers, imagined what great opportunities the creation of a new center of the metallurgical industry here in Kerch promises. One of the engineers, who had just graduated from the Polytechnic Institute, was an ardent patriot of Kerch. He dreamed of a large-scale boron industry, of the possibility of using the energy of gas jets. He spoke about the possibility of discovering oil here, complained about the unbearable conditions of the Tsarist regime, which hindered the free development of the productive forces of the region. 20 years have passed since then. In the capital of Czechoslovakia, in Prague, in 1936, we received an offer to inspect the famous silver lead mine Pozibran and the old mining academy in the same city. At the station, we were greeted solemnly. We were put not on cars, but in a carriage drawn by a pair of horses, with a coachman dressed in an old mountain uniform. We descended to a depth of 1,300 meters to the mine on an excellent elevator, collected a rich collection of silver lead ores. After inspecting the mine, we drove to the mining academy, where an official reception awaited us. Still on the stairs, we were met by the attendants, who, passing us one to another, led us into a small assembly hall, on the threshold of which stood the rector of the academy with a large gold chain on his chest. In a short speech in Czech, he greeted me, a scientist from a Soviet country. He spoke about the communication of two kindred peoples, Czechs and Russians, about the common tasks of science and economy. I answered him in Russian, noting our deep interest in the mining of Czechoslovakia and in the historical mining school of the old Czech Mining Academy. The official part is over. The rector took off his chain, came up to me, patted me on the shoulder and said in pure Russian, "Well, now let's speak Russian. Don't you recognize me? I am the engineer with whom you once spent the last night on the shores of the Kerch Strait. I told you that I would not be able to hold out in Tsarist Russia, and now, in my new post, I am strengthening the ties between our Czechoslovak youth and Soviet science. I am finishing my Memoirs of Crimea. During the years of Soviet power, I again had a chance to visit the Crimea several times and visit many fields. Before my eyes, the Crimean Peninsula began to turn from an agricultural region into a real mining region. A powerful Kerch metallurgical plant has grown, which not only produces excellent cast iron, but also converts phosphorus into a valuable fertilizer, Thomas slag. Vanadium dispersed in hundredths of a percent is extracted for the needs of vanadium steel, which is necessary for the automotive industry. A large salt farm grew up near Sochi. These are not just those mountains of salt that were extracted from the lake with shovels in the old days. Now all the remnants of brine, magnesium salts, as well as potassium and bromine are used. Sivish salts are also successfully used. The needs of socialist construction put forward the need for grandiose development of decorative and building stone, including that beautiful diorite from which the environs of Kerch, Esquiorda and the southern coast of the Crimea were composed. I will not enumerate the most diverse minerals that have been discovered on the territory of the Crimea. Suffice it to point out that about 200 mineral deposits have been discovered and studied in the Crimea, starting with gems for jewelry and ending with the most valuable limestone for the facing of the Moscow metro and pure limestone for fluxes of metallurgical plants. Already from these data, we see how peculiar the mineral nature of Crimea is and how many new and interesting things Crimea will discover when research illuminates still little explored corners. Very serious and still, in fact, insufficiently covered are the problems associated with balneology and resort business. The air with ozone, oxygen, hydrogen peroxide, ionization, radioactive emanations, the special chemical composition of the air saturated with the salt spray of the sea, salt and mineral springs, salt lakes, mud and silts, all this represents exceptional riches after all. Many hundreds of thousands of patients strive to the shores of the Black Sea to improve their health with clean air and life-giving sea. But I will always have old mineralogical memories associated with Crimea. Crimea was my first university. He taught me to be interested in nature and to love it. He taught me to work, to reveal the secrets of natural resources, and not in a quick inspection, driving a car or on a horse, but like this, crawling on all fours for many days on the same rock, watching all the convolutions of barely noticeable veins, building a picture of the past from individual trifles and details and fantasizing about the future, only with such an acquaintance with nature, from the hot experiences that the child's soul experiences. From each find of a well-cut rock crystal, a true understanding of nature is born. And I remember with deep gratitude the wonderful school that I went through more than 50 years ago in the Crimea. From childhood memories, Greece, Austria, Czech Republic. After a heavy roll on the Black Sea, our steamer entered the Bosphorus at dawn and soon dropped anchor against Constantinople. The noise of the boats surrounding the steamer, the whistling of steamers and boats, the ray of bright sun penetrating through the porthole woke me up, and I learned that we were already in Constantinople. I still remember the bitter tears that I, a little 7-year-old boy, shed when I was not woken up at the entrance to the Bosphorus. I could not calm down for a long time because they had promised to wake me up. Neither the dogs lying in the streets of Istanbul by the hundreds, nor the large shoes that I climbed into with my boots to inspect the Hagia Sophia Mosque, nor the promises that I would be able to look at the Dardanelles all night, calmed me down. A day later we left for Greece. I remember the enchanting Sea of Marmara and my father's first stories about marble. He was fond of architecture at that time and told me about the works of ancient Greek art that we will see in Athens, about different types of marble, white, pink, yellow and green, back in the famous Hagia Sophia. He led me to the walls of polished, spotted green Macedonian stone Verde Antico, and on the slopes of the Prince's Islands through binoculars he showed me from a distance the breaks of pink marble. The word marble became somehow sacred to me. I couldn't wait for us to finally reach Piraeus. But then we landed at the pier and drove in a cab to Athens along a dusty road, lined with olive trees. I have almost no impressions of my trip to Greece. I only remember how I rolled off the couch during a rather strong earthquake, which made a great impression on me, and how for a long time I could not get a convincing answer from anyone to my questions why, where and when the earthquake occurred. I also remember the picture of the Euxine Bay of the enchanting Mediterranean Sea, and the flat pebbles on which the quiet waves murmured. I collected a whole collection of these stones in a small box, and these first collections of childhood were kept by me until I handed over my collection to the First Chanyavsky People's University in Moscow, where I was the first lecturer on mineralogy. Among these flat pebbles were marbles of various colors, serpentines, limestones, flints, and agates. But at last we went to see the Acropolis. We climbed the half-ruined stone stairs to the Parthenon. Everything here was made of marble, columns, steps, walls. Fragments of semi-translucent white sparkling stone lay around. You see, it is written here, my father said to me, that it is strictly forbidden to take even a piece of stone. Keep that in mind, Sasha. But how could I not take a piece of marble? And while my father and his companions were admiring the Erechtheion, I discreetly put 3 pieces of marble of different colors in my pocket. For a long time I did not show them to my parents, and only when we left Greece did I proudly admit that I had stolen as many as 3 pieces of marble. Again, isolated fragmentary pictures, Corfu, the Adriatic with its variegated sails, southern Italy, where we were surrounded by whole crowds of beggars, its dirty yellow roads, Venice with its canals, black, gloomy gondolas and wonderful Venetian glass, striking with the purity and brightness of colors and the combination of transparency with brilliance. I could not understand the difference between glass and natural stone. Why I should not collect pieces of glass when they are even more beautiful and shiny. But my mother, who was well acquainted with geology and mineralogy, strictly forbade me to collect them, saying, "Don't rush at everything, for I see that you have envious eyes not only at stones, at corals, in Italian trinkets, at shells, in overseas stores, at the branches of polyps, but also at glass. You can't do that. How are we going to take it all home? After all, they will take it away at customs." And the fear of customs, as if it was some kind of monster, stopped me. Pictures of alpine lakes, the fabulous Lake Garda with overhanging cliffs, the first snowy peaks, glaciers with their white tongues flew by. Shiny mica flip-flops were already in my collection, wrapped in cotton, with a piece of paper on which was written in large childish handwriting, "Lake Garda." These pictures were very fleeting, and I have almost no memory of them. But then we reached the goal of our trip, the Bohemian resort of Carlsbad, where my mother went annually to be treated for a serious liver disease. After this first journey, I accompanied her 10 more times to this mineralogical paradise, and 40 years later, I had to begin the pilgrimage to that city again, but this time for my own treatment. Carlsbad, now the Czechoslovak Karlovy Vary, left a huge imprint on my life and determined my interests. Here, in this fashionable, luxurious resort, I got acquainted for the first time with a wide variety of stones, with their beauty and price. These were the heyday of mining in Bohemia. Tin and tungsten ores were still mined in the ore mountains, and the wonderful brushes of cassiterite, scheelite, quartz were carefully removed from the veins and sold to vacationers. In the shops one could find Uranian tar ore. In those years, just cheap garbage for the preparation of yellow paints for porcelain and bricks. Wonderful brushes of rock crystal from the Alps, salt from Kannegit. Paired needles of actinolite with dark green epidotes were brought from Tyrol. Among all this variety are the fabulous stones of Carlsbad itself, the sediments of its hot springs, pea-shaped stones, aragonite flows, whole bouquets of flowers covered with Carlsbad stone, caskets, knives made of stone. In the beautiful shop windows there were crystals, druses, brushes on glass shelves, and next to them there were small numbers, the price. Oh, how much childish excitement I experienced because of these figures. How much savings had to be accumulated in order to buy balls of rhodochrosite on a rhodium rod, or smoky quartz from the top of St. Gothard. For a walk along the Tepel River, stones could be bought cheaper. Here they sold beautifully laid out on black velvet Carlsbad doubles of feldspar, pieces of kaolin, from which the famous Czech porcelain was made, olivine bombs and pyroxenes from the basalts of Rodisdorf. I have studied every stone on display in the shop. I still think of the few pieces of calcite from Cumberland that I bought and, oh horror, dropped on the road and broke. Bursting into bitter tears, I could only see the cleavage of calcite, and how I cursed that cleavage when my mother told me that if it had not been there, then the stone, perhaps, would not have broken. When I was a little older, I began to collect minerals myself near Carlsbad, knocked out doubles of feldspar from granite, collected volcanic bombs from the extinct quaternary volcano of Kammerbal, near Eger, and hexagonal columns of biotite in the basalt tuffs of Gispel. But most of all, I was struck by the Carlsbad scum. At a height of 9 meters, a hot stream of the Sprudel spring gushed out. It poured out of the bowl in whole streams, depositing brown scum of aragonite at its bottom, which enveloped the quartz grains and turned them into balls, peas grains. How is that? So the stones are also growing? I asked my relatives with bewilderment. I must say that I never received a satisfactory answer, and I was quite incomprehensible to the difference between the growth of a stone and the growth of a plant. Sometimes my uncle, a chemist, and his friend, the later famous Professor I. Golubov, tried to explain to me the basics of chemical processes and the growth of Carlsbad stone. I remember, as I do now, their wise arguments on chemical topics, while I carefully wrote down the names of minerals and wrote down what the stone consists of under their dictation. Their conversations on chemical topics remained completely incomprehensible to me, but I saw in them something so important and wise that my greatest pleasure was to listen to their arguments about complex organic reactions and chemical transformations of ethers and alcohols. My father had completely different conversations with me. I was not yet 10 years old when he made me read aloud Goethe, his favorite poet, and tried to explain to me a number of very difficult poems, completely incomprehensible to me and, frankly, completely uninteresting. The only thing that reconciled me with Goethe was that he also loved stones and was a mineralogist. My father told me that Goethe began his mineralogical and geological research in Carlsbad, that he came there many times for treatment in the first years of the 6th century, that he was the first to study the granites of these places, and explained their origin from molten masses that, despite the fact that the treatment required a lot of time, 10 glasses of water in the morning, and 6 in the evening and 3 hours of sitting in Sprudel's baths, he still managed to visit deposits, stone breaks and mines with a hammer in his hand, with a knapsack for botanical preparations on his shoulders. Here his theory of the origin of colors was first born, later refuted by the successes of the wave theory of light, and only now again restored its significance in the history of science. At the same time, a major scientific event took place in Carlsbad, which, of course, I could not appreciate at the time, and only much later understood its significance. In 1895, at a Congress of Physicians in Carlsbad, the famous geologist Edward Swiss, impressed by the power of the Bohemian baths and Sprudel, was the first to put forward the theory of juvenile waters, the waters that first poured out of the depths to the surface, to the light, to the sun, the waters of cooling molten underground hearths. He, Swiss, with his inherent originality and depth of thought, laid the foundation for new ideas in the field of the study of mineral waters. And although many of his ideas have now taken shape, the idea of the connection of hot thermi with molten depths or veins and tectonic faults has played a huge role in the history of science. But these heights of science were inaccessible to a 12-year-old boy who loved stone for the rest of his life. We always returned home from Carlsbad to Odessa via Vienna. It was an old, bright, elegant Vienna, the first large foreign city that I saw and which made an indelible impression on me. Tens of millions of rubles were spent on the creation of these two exceptional palace museums, and for me, there was nothing better in the world than one of them, and not even the whole museum, but its first huge halls. Passing through a vast vestibule and climbing the stairs, we found ourselves in the halls with the famous collection of stone. In those years it was the first museum in the world. Now it has yielded first place to the British Museum. In beautiful halls, stone reigned, not on the shelves of shop windows in a boring order, but under huge glass bells. There were whole forests of snow-white iron flowers from Styria, grandiose brushes of glass transparent as glass cubes of Velichka salt near Krakow, opals of Hungary. At the top on the walls there are pictures of mines and deposits. A separate hall was set aside for huge meteorites, stones falling from the sky. Further on are the halls of ores and minerals. What could be more beautiful than this museum? For me, nothing else existed in Vienna. With a bored look, I followed my father through the halls of painting, only became somewhat animated when he explained to me the architecture of the Gothic temples, stretching to the sky, and experienced an overwhelming feeling of grief in front of the marble tomb of the Augustinian chapel. No, only a museum, only a museum. Having carefully wrapped my minerals in paper and cotton wool, and still burning with memories of the diamond bouquet of Maria Theresa, or the beautiful stalactites of the caves. I returned home to Odessa to dream again of the stone, of the museum, to collect nudes on Lengarin, to trace the veins of rock crystal in the porphyrites of Simferopol with a knife. And in my childhood and youthful dreams, I pictured pictures of the future. Large expeditions for stone. We find entire grottos of rock crystal. Mysterious stalactite caves lead us to underground rivers. Amethyst brushes line huge veins. We go to distant, unknown countries, on camels, in carts pulled by buffaloes. On Captain Nemo's submarines, we descend into the depths of the ocean for pearls. The collections of stones we brought are sparkling. Scientists congratulate us on the discoveries of new minerals, new crystals and rocks. Next to my bed is a closet with my small collection, and I fall asleep in these dreams, inspired by Jules Verne, Cooper, Abbas, Memories of Vienna, Carlsbad, inspired by the Kingdom of Stone. The years of gymnasium study passed. The fascination with minerals grew. After my first youthful acquaintance with mineralogy, after Neumeyer's History of the Earth, a book with which I never parted, after my enthusiasm for my own collection, which gradually grew into a beautiful mineralogical collection, arranged according to all the rules of science, I was preparing to enter a university or a mining institute, and had already firmly outlined my life path. Fleeting passions for the poems of Horace or Sophocles did not interfere with my collection of minerals in the Crimea and the Caucasus. For hours I worked with a hammer, chisel, pickaxe on individual veins with calcite and palygorskite in Kerch, looked through elegant zeolites in the melophyres of Sablov and rock crystals in the chalk rocks of the northern slopes of the Taurida Mountains. These hours of observation left a lasting impression. They taught me to understand details, taught me the very difficult and complex duty of a natural scientist to observe. I was 12 years old when I began to write down my observations, and in spite of the simplicity and groundlessness of these notes, they were of great service to me when, in 1903, I wrote one of my first scientific works, Mineralogy of the Environs of Simferopol. Admission to Novorossiysk University, however, almost led to the collapse of my dream. Dissatisfied with the lectures on mineralogy of Professor R.A. Prendel, disappointed in this boring descriptive science, I began to be carried away by lectures on the history of art, on political economy, which was so brilliantly delivered by Professor Ornotsky, geophysics and especially molecular physics in the beautiful exposition of private docent B.P. Weinberg. Only later did I realize what a lifelong impression a well-structured and well-conducted course of university lectures makes. There is no doubt that I owe my interest in the structure of matter, in the problems of molecular chemistry, first of all to Boris Petrovich Weinberg and Professor Peter Grigorievich Melikoshvili. From my childhood, I remembered the exceptional figure of Professor Melikoshvili, one of the most honored figures of the renewed Georgia. When Pyotr Grigorievich visited our house, I huddled in a corner in the dining room and listened, of course, to his stories about new trends in science. From his hands I received the first X-ray of a frog. I greedily absorbed his explanations about different waves of light, sound, heat, and carefully asked what a drop was, whether all drops were the same, why feldspar was called feldspar, and how I could fulfill my old dream of getting a piece of meteorite. And he himself brought it to me, a small nondescript piece of heavenly stone, the pride of my collection. At the university, he was the first to very sharply oppose my enthusiasm for the history of art, to rebuke me for launching lectures on mineralogy and especially botany, and in a fatherly way strictly reminding me that I must not depart from mineralogy and chemistry for him. There were no boundaries between these two sciences, and he required me to study chemistry persistently. But I could not tear myself away from the lectures of Ornotsky, the revolutionary Arnotsky, as we said, which dragged me in. I could not give up my enthusiasm for practical studies with capillaries at Weinberg's and perhaps would have completely forgotten about mineralogy. If not for a sharp change in my life, my father was transferred to Moscow, and I moved to Moscow University, about which Melikoshvili spoke with such reverence. It was not without fear that I came to the mineralogical office of Moscow University. I was so nervous that I couldn't speak, and the professor, looking through his big glasses, seemed so stern to me. He directed me to a small 12-meter room, a mineralogical laboratory. To his even more terrifying assistant, I was given a place in the corner, near the stove, and was given to study a piece of the mineral jarosite from the island of Chelykin. Thus began my many years of work with Professor Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky and his student, Pavel Karlovich Alexit, who died tragically. Thus began the wonderful 5 years of my university life in Moscow, in a close-knit family of mineralogists. These were the heyday of Vladimir Ivanovich's mineralogical works. There were not many of us in his office. We worked in the laboratory for at least 12 hours, often staying overnight if the tests were going on for a whole day. Twice a week, we read reports in the circle of V.I. Vernadsky, sorted out the collections with him, listened to his fascinating lectures. University life with Klyuchevsky's brilliant speeches, years of struggle for higher education, Vernadsky's enormous scientific and social authority, all this left its mark on us. And we were proud of our small laboratory, proud of our museum, proud of every printed work that came out of our old and neglected mineralogical study. Moscow University and the beginning of independent work. It was 1903. 2 small semi-dark rooms in the old building of Moscow University, and on an area of barely 20 square meters, 7 work tables of chemists, mineralogists. In the semi-dark basement, fume hoods for chemical work. On the window of the same room, precise chemical balances, a huge wide stove. Such was the mineralogical laboratory of Professor Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, from which a huge number of excellent scientists and researchers came and where ideas were born, which later laid the foundation for an entire scientific school. When I came to Moscow, the younger generation worked here. Here was G.O. Kasparovich, who discovered a rich deposit of indium in the zinc blend of Transcaucasia. Somewhat later, I.A. Tolkrelidze, who later became a full member of the Academy of Sciences in Tbilisi, began his work here. Our motley family, which evaporated chemical solutions all night long, then took a stormy part in student gatherings, was united by the main assistant of V.I. Vernadsky, Pavel Karlovich Alexit. Strict, dry-looking. Under his leadership, we went through a brilliant school. He checked our every step, forcing us to repeat the tests many times until they gave a positive result. Many interesting minerals were brought by P.K. Alexat from his numerous travels around Russia. He was the first to pay attention to the minerals of the Ilmen Mountains and, together with the exiled Pole Shishkovsky, was the first to outline the practical use of the Ilmen nepheline. He was especially merciless and strict with the printed word. He looked through each of our articles submitted for publication, critically, mercilessly throwing out every superfluous word, striving for accuracy, clarity and brevity of presentation. He did his tests with us, but we never knew exactly what he was doing. A long, low corridor that passed by the famous conference room led to the upper floor, which we treated with some fear. There was a large office of Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky with spectrographic installations. There was a huge hall with magnificent old collections of Moscow University. There sat the professors, senior assistants, now deceased, Y.V. Samoylov N.I. Sergunov and V.V. Karandiv. Almost every day V.I. Vernadsky came down to our laboratory. Not without trepidation, we awaited his coming, his invariable "What do you have?" He was full of interest in all our topics. He was fascinated by the problems of mineral chemistry and the ideas of young geochemistry that were already in the air at that time. Every month, meetings of the Mineralogical Circle took place at the top, at which we shared the experience of our work and at which V.I. Vernadsky always developed his new ideas for us. All of us had to work in the Museum on Collections. V.I. Vernadsky insisted that we systematically examine minerals, that we should stuff our eyes on hundreds, thousands of samples, that we should learn to identify the samples sent to us, and be able to accurately record them in the inventory. Spring came, and Vladimir Ivanovich, with his characteristic enthusiasm, dragged us on excursions and expeditions. He said that the faculty did not understand how necessary real expeditions were for a mineralogist. It was obvious to everyone that expeditions were needed by geologists, but that mineralogists also needed trips was completely incomprehensible. After all, they have to sit in their office, measure crystals, and do chemical analyses of minerals. But Vladimir Ivanovich had a different opinion. Our first student trips were held near Moscow itself in Khrushchev, Dorogomilov, Mayachkovo, Podolsk. We especially loved to go to Dorogomilovo. There, near the old brewery, there was a wonderful quarry, which no longer exists. Here, in the dense limestone, whole geodes or layers of dense brown flint were found. You break a geode with a hammer, and inside there is a void lined with crystals of rock crystal or limespar. If near Oberilovka, these same crystals acquired a light purple shade of amethyst, then here they were pure white. I remember how once Vladimir Ivanovich, looking closely at these crystals, drew our attention to the fact that they are all short columnar, that in them the hatching follows the basopanocoid, while in real rock crystals the crystals are elongated with vertical hatching. In fact, these were the first ideas about typomorphic minerals. We call typomorphic minerals those mineral bodies whose properties change regularly, and definitely depending on the conditions of their formation in this way. The color, shape of crystals, their appearance, chemical composition, etc. can change. Now typomorphic minerals occupy a whole section of our mineralogy. Many times we visited the outcrops of black Jurassic clays on the banks of the Moscow River, near Khrushchev. Here the shells of the ammonites were turned into solid pyrite. Its weathering gave crystals of gypsum or covered these formations with a green coating of iron sulfate. I remember how Vladimir Ivanovich drew our attention to the fact that the coating of vitriol is only a temporary formation, that the first rain is enough to wash away the soluble salts, oxidize the iron and cover the beautiful shells of ammonite with brown rusty spots. The mineral was depicted in the words of Vladimir Ivanovich not as something dead, constant, unchanging. We learned to understand the history of the mineral, its formation from iron pyrite, its death in streams of water, its transformation into new compounds. We learned to look at the nature around us with new eyes, and each stone turned out to be connected with it by thousands of threads, which stretched not only to raindrops, not only to the remains of ancient shells, but also to modern life, to organic solutions of the surface, to the activity of man himself. The word geochemistry had not yet been pronounced, but we became geochemists by pondering and delving into the eternal laws of the chemical transformation of the earth. Finally, the third field we visited was in Podolsk. Here was a huge quarry of a cement factory, and here the pictures of the chemical processes of the earth's crust were even more widely revealed to us. In limestones, the processes of dolomite formation took place. Whole layers of silicified rocks appeared, and among them, thin layers, like felt, lay films of palygorskite, this wonderful mineral that looked like a rag. Black Jurassic clays covered ancient Carboniferous limestones. Chemical reactions occurred between clays and limestone. A number of remarkable minerals, including a new silica hydrate, shaniavskite, were studied and described in these works. In the cracks of limestone, stalactites and stalagmites were formed. Large syntheses decorated the walls of these cracks. And what was our surprise, when in one place they turned out to be colored green with nickel salts. We soon became convinced that this coloring was caused by the fact that there was an old scrap iron on top, and there were probably remnants of nickel products in it. Obviously, our carbonates have been growing over the past decades before the eyes of man himself. In 1910, a new page in our activities began. The newly opened Chaniavsky People's University became the center of mineralogical work of amateurs. Local historians and stone lovers were drawn to the mineralogical laboratory of this beautiful institution, which, although it did not have a real folk character, was still a new, fresh stream in the musty atmosphere of the old regime. It was here that we decided to create the mineralogy of the Moscow region. How many wonderful problems were put forward then? How many practical tasks grew out of the needs of Moscow and its construction? But I must admit that we did not do the planned work. The grandiose construction of Moscow, the Moscow-Volga Canal, the largest energy plants using peat, brown coal, grandiose chemical plants, the construction of the metro and railway stations decorated with marble near Moscow. All this is only a part of the mineralogical problems that the new Moscow stirred up, requiring millions of tons of construction and road materials, fluxes, energy and chemical raw materials. And in 1933, 30 years later, we again put forward the same problem, the study of mineralogy and geochemistry of the Moscow region. It is necessary to know the picture of all those chemical substances from which the central Moscow region basin is composed. It is necessary to examine all the quarries, deposits with the eye of a mineralogist. The first object that attracted our attention was the violet mineral ratovkit, described for the first time in 1813 by Fischer von Waldheim, a professor at Moscow University and the founder of the Moscow Society of Naturalists. Ratovkit is calcium fluoride, a fluorspar with few traces of contamination with other salts. It lies as a layer in the lower part of the Moscow stage of Carboniferous limestone, in the Ritovsky ravine in the Vereysky district of the Moscow region. One of the students of the Chaniavsky University seriously studied the problem of this mineral, and soon found out that after von Waldheim, a number of geologists described it in the 70s of the 6th century. In many places along the tributaries of the Volga, the Osuga and Vazuza rivers. Where could this wonderful mineral come from, which we are used to seeing in hot ore veins, in deposits of volatile sublimations rising from the depths, where granite molten hearths cool? How can we imagine the formation of these layers, especially after it turned out that ratovkit is found in grey limestones along the Kalmius River, not far from the Sea of Azov, that the same mineral was discovered in the same limestones in the Urals, and later in a number of places in Tartaria? Is it possible to admit that somewhere under the huge Kom platform, occupied by the European part of the Soviet Union, molten masses once boiled, the breath of which rose to the bottom of the deep Carboniferous seas? All these questions remained, in fact, unresolved. But when several times in our excursions we looked closely at the violet layers that stood out brightly against the background of white limestone, when we saw how correctly they stretched in whole definite horizons together with brown flint and green clay, then we began to look for the cause of their origin, not in ancient and deep volcanic masses, but in the vital activity of marine organisms. We know that fluorine, like its analogues chlorine, bromine and iodine, accumulates in a number of organic substances that extract it from seawater, where it is dispersed. And the more we got acquainted with this remarkable mineral, the more we had to take the side of the biogenic hypothesis, which is now confirmed by new finds of not violet, but white and yellowish fluorite, which forms cement in the sandstones of the higher horizons of the Moscow stage. The fascination with Ratovkit gradually led us to the study of the deeper horizons of the Moscow deposits, those layers that lie in the depths under the Moscow limestone, but the outcrops of which can be seen along the edges of the Moscow basin, this bowl of the old Carboniferous Sea. Here our attention was attracted by brown coals with their varied, complex and as yet completely unexplored minerals. And it was not so much the coal itself that attracted our attention, but those nodules of pyrites, siderites, ferrosiderite, and various clays that accompany the brown coal beds, not only to the south of Moscow, in the region of Tula and Ryazan, but also along the entire northwestern border of the Carboniferous Bowl, up to the city of Borovichi, where these brown coals attracted attention as a source of fuel more than 150 years ago. Here, in a picturesque area near Borovichi, we carried out a number of search operations. On the banks of the Emestio River, there were numerous mines from which coal and the accompanying refractory clays and quartz sands were extracted. It had long been known that these brown coals were of poor quality, that they were overflowing with small and large constrictions of iron pyrite. But imagine our surprise when in one nook and cranny we saw that these nodules of pyrite were covered with a silvery leaden coating. These were the smallest crystals of lead luster. Among them, we later found zinc blende and even copper pyrite, and in large nodules among the sands. All these ore minerals turned out to be in very good crystals. Thus, unexpectedly, we discovered not only lead, zinc and copper, but even, as our analyses showed, negligible traces of silver and gold. Once again, we were faced with the task of unraveling the origin of these interesting minerals. We are used to seeing them, as well as fluorspar, in hot ore veins, where they are deposited at a temperature of 200 to 300 and even 400. How did these metals get into the layers of coal formed from plant residues? Perhaps here too we must think of some chemical reactions caused by vegetable organisms. Or perhaps minute traces of these metals were deposited on the rotting remains of plants from the cold aqueous solutions of the Earth's surface. We had a fact in front of us, and only guesses went beyond this fact. We studied the Carboniferous Basin deeper and further. We wanted to go into even deeper layers of our basin, to deal with rare aluminum hydrates in Devonian limestones. We were also attracted by higher horizons. We went to the Oka, collected magnificent crystals of gypsum from the Permian sediments, brought dozens of kilograms of mountain folder and mountain skin, the same palygorskite. We have seen the spring waters carry away the rags and leaves of this strange mineral, and find it entangled in the coastal bushes, along with the brushwood thrown out by the river. Gradually, the whole complex picture of the chemical processes that took place in the Moscow basin was revealed to us. The shallow Devonian basins were replaced here by deep Carboniferous seas. Then the sediments of salt lakes, gypsum and dolomites fell on their sediments. But what is all this mass of sediments almost 2 kilometers thick on? What is the pressure of this enormous gravity, which causes a pressure of tens of atmospheres in the depths? Where is the bottom of the Moscow region basin, on which rests the bowl of oceans, seas and lakes that have been swaying for almost 1 billion years? Geologists have tried to answer this question theoretically, but mineralogists and geochemists need more than theoretical conclusions. He needs real facts, real objects, minerals that he can look at and analyze. And in 1934, the first deep well was laid in Zamoskvorechi. It passed through Carboniferous limestones, sediments of the sandy coal-bearing stage, and came across huge layers of solid gypsum. The waters, gushing from a depth of 700 to 800 meters, turned out to be saturated with salt. These hot waters, with a temperature of about 35, contained enormous amounts of sodium salts and other metals, But what is most striking is that these were real brines of salt pools, not only with chlorine, but also with bromine and iodine. And what lies even deeper than the 1,300 meters to which the well has reached? How many more hundreds of meters separate us from the solid granites or gneisses that underlie the entire basin and form the ancient slab, the phonosomation shield that lies at the base of all of Eastern Europe, determining the geological destinies of 2 billion years of its history? What problems will the mineralogy and geochemistry of not only these crystalline rocks, but also of the ancient sediments that cover their surfaces, pose to us? Is this not a formidable problem facing mineralogists and geochemists? I have told only a small part of those mineralogical formations that attract our attention in the Moscow region. I have not talked about the wonderful clays with bleaching properties, refractory and acid resistant. I have not spoken about the most interesting mineralogy of peat bogs, about iron paints formed in different places of the Kalinin region, about beautiful limestone tuffs, about the Simferopol remains of fresh lakes located to the south of the Valdai upland. The mineralogy and geochemistry of the large basin near Moscow cannot remain unstudied and undescribed. Such work should be undertaken as a matter of urgency, and we are waiting for the enthusiasm of young geologists and amateurs of our region, local historians, young pioneers of mineralogy and geochemistry of Moscow. Let's get to work, young friends, mineralogists and geochemists, on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. For several years after graduating from Moscow University in 1907, I lived on the banks of the Neckar River in Heidelberg, studying in the laboratory of Professor W. M. Goldschmidt, where I worked on the crystallography of diamonds. Hard work on the diamond took me up to 15 hours a day. Only on Sundays was it possible to break out and visit the quarries, mines, factories of Eastern Germany, to see museums and mainly large quantities of precious stones. In Frankfurt, Ada, Hanau, Berlin, tens of thousands of carats of natural diamonds were scattered on special tables in front of me. For hours I selected the best crystals of this strange mineral, not noticing that with the help of a system of mirrors, my hands were being watched from another room, taking into account my every movement. The selected stones were sent through a bank to the University of Heidelberg, where they were sent for research. In the summer months I took longer journeys, such as Paris with its famous Montmartre gypsums, the sandstones of Fontainebleau, the volcanoes of central France, the ore veins and alpine veins of Switzerland. However, I was drawn mainly to the south, to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Already in 1908 I reached Milan. I spent the whole day on the roof of the Milan Cathedral and watched the restoration of the marble carvings, sent postcards to my relatives and immediately drank cold orangeade in the buffet on the roof. Only 3 hours' drive separates Milan from the Mediterranean, and, counting my scanty capital in a badly empty purse, I decided to take a cheap working train to Genoa. The sea, bright, blue, mighty, amazed me. And here, in the port of the city, with its gigantic transoceanic ships, and in Nervi among the palm trees and agaves, I felt for the first time the beauty and charm of the south. But I had almost no money. I had to spend the night on a bench in the garden, and only with difficulty did I get to Heidelberg. Even then, I had the idea to go to Italy for minerals. Not to the cities of Italy with the crowd of tourists I hate, not to art galleries, not even to the famous cemetery of Campo Santo in the city of Pisa, where the art of the sculptor is emphasized by the beauty of the stone itself, Carrara marble, red and green porphyry, gloomy, dark jade and Siena marbles of cheerful, yellow tones. I decided to go to see the little visited mines of Volterra, the Sophians of Tuscany, to climb the peaks of the Carrara Alps. But the main goal of my journey was the island of Elba, that well-known corner of the Italian land, about which so much was written by Krantz, Loti, Docchiodi, Rath and others, and from which the minerals sparkled with all colors in all the museums of the world. At the beginning of April, I set out on a hike. It seemed to me that as soon as we passed through the street Gothard tunnel in the rumbling train, we would be greeted by the heat. And so my uniform consisted of a straw hat, light shoes, and a white suit, with a backpack on my back and hammers in my hands. I seemed to look rather unusual, for at the train station in Milan someone contemptuously said vagabundo, which almost meant highwayman. This was understandable, since there was a snowstorm all over northern Italy. The passengers in the unheated carriages were shivering from the cold, and I, in my straw hat and light suit, looked somewhat embarrassed at the cold winter landscape of Italy, which had not yet woken up by spring. I went to Pisa to see the collections at the university to get the necessary maps and instructions. Pisa is a very interesting city in Italy for a mineralogist. The old university has excellent collections of minerals from Tuscany, and especially from the island of Elba. With a shudder I entered the unheated hotel room, and for the first and only time in my life I climbed into bed as I was, in a light coat and wet shoes. And in Pisa the weather was no better. I was no longer up to the Leaning Tower, and I continued to shiver in the unheated room of the University of Pisa. Alois's young assistant, later a famous professor of mineralogy in Florence, showed me the wonderful minerals from the island of Elba. I went on, and late in the evening, after a number of changes, arrived at Piombino, from where steamers went to the island of Elba. But a fierce storm was raging on the sea. The steamer could not approach the wharf, and I had to get into a boat with a dim flashlight on the bow. I was splashed with spray at every blow of the wave. The boat was beaten against the gangway, and it was not without difficulty that I climbed to the deck of the rickety vessel that was to take me to Portoferraio, the chief city of the island of Elba. At about 12 o'clock at night, after a tedious passage, we entered a calm bay, and very soon we were on the shore. A large white building towered over the wharf. It was the main hotel of the city, the former palace of the Ural miners Demidovs, and now a simple trattoria, which means tavern. Completely exhausted, I fell asleep in a large, high room with an alcove and two wide windows. Early in the morning, I was woken up by the sun, the blue sky without a single cloud, bright southern colors. Under my windows was the bazaar of local peasants and agaves. Palm trees and yuccas completed the picture. It's warm, even hot, a completely different world, some piece of Africa. As I was convinced during my almost 3-month stay on the island of Elbe, it was a time when a carefree crowd of Tuscan peasants was merrily singing in every possible way the Son Española, which had just been transferred here from Spain. This was the time when Italy, poor in natural resources, was switching to its own iron production, and tall chimneys, blast furnaces and carperas towered in the southern part of the bay. Here it is, the enchanting island where Napoleon spent almost a year of his exile. 2 names, Napoleon's and Demidov's, are repeated on the island at every step. A fairy tale legend surrounds the name of Napoleon. And when you ask about anything good, about good roads, about a beautiful fortress, about vineyards, you usually get the answer that all this was done by Napoleon. He lived in a palace a few kilometers from Portoferraio. Its apartments with beautiful frescoes are still preserved, but the palace has experienced many vicissitudes. Together with part of the possessions, it was acquired by the Ural miners Demidovs, who received the title of Counts of San Donato, then ruined by the reckless revelry and theft of the Ural managers. The Demidovs sold their possessions and the palace to the merchant Del Buono, who turned it into a champagne factory. My wanderings around the island began. I hired a 2-wheeler, drawn by a mule or a horse, and an old man whom I called Papa drove me along beautiful roads. to the most remote corners of the island, which has an area of about 220 square kilometers. Geologically, the island is divided into 3 parts. Its middle part, where the city and the factory are located, is less interesting. Of the greatest mineralogical importance is the western extremity of the island, which is a huge granite massif rising steeply from the Blue Sea to a height of about 1 kilometer. The famous tertiary granite of Monte Capain. A narrow horseback path, 50 kilometers long, encircles the gloomy and deserted rocks of this massif. This path was once used by horse patrols to guard Napoleon, and it is here that memories of the past arise at every step. For long hours I wandered along this path, which is now collapsed all the way to the westernmost extremity of the rock, where stood a small stone structure in which Napoleon rested, and in front of him in the west were the outlines of his homeland, Corsica. In clear weather, the vague contours of Sardinia and the Genoese Alps can be seen from here. Flat as a leaf lies the islet of Pianosa in the north, and in the south, the fabulous island of Monte Cristo, where only one family of shepherds lives, rises like a sharp peak right out of the water. For almost a month, I worked on the minerals and contacts of Monte Capain. Here I first got acquainted with the complexity and beauty of the pegmatite process. The population extracted stone stuffs from pegmatite veins, highly appreciating their beauty, in the walls and fences of mountain villages, especially in the famous village of San Pietro in Campo. Individual druses and minerals of feldspar, tourmaline and quartz could be seen. These boulders were carefully guarded by the local population, who are proud of the minerals of their island. Into separate quarries, pegmatite, variegated black-headed tourmalines testanera, swirling twins of dactyardite, rare tin stone crystals, and the most remarkable mineral of these veins, pollux, the world's only compound of the silicate metal cesium, similar in appearance to simple quartz, were mined. I spent whole days here, on these granites, and many hundreds of magnificent specimens were carefully taken out by me and brought to Moscow. Sometimes I slept among the rocks, admiring the lights of the scurrying steamers and the distant white glow of the many lights. Far to the east, these were the fires of Civita Vecchia, and behind it the fires of Rome. Very soon my old Latin language began to be transformed into the Tuscan dialect. I was already able to talk freely with the population, who had ceased to be amazed at the visiting Englishmen, as they are accustomed to call all foreigners in general. Late at night, I was returning home in my two-wheeler. At the city gates, we were menacingly questioned by a customs official. Medieval castles opened, and we drove noisily onto the stone pavement of the fortress. But one day, we were confused by an unusual picture. The streets were full of people, there was a great excitement everywhere, and all the trattorias were open. Metal burst out of one blast furnace, and about 30 workers died in the molten mass. Italian gendarmes with rooster feathers on their hats walked around the city in groups. The excited crowd did not calm down for a long time, condemning the perpetrators of this misfortune. I was finishing my tour of the island on the western part of it, where the famous deposits of iron luster, pyrite and magnetic ironstone are located. In the valley of the Rio Marino River, where a new mineral Ulvate, after the old Tuscan name of this island, Ulva, was first discovered. It is difficult to imagine a more remarkable picture than this world deposit. Crystals of iron luster sparkled dazzlingly in the sun, shimmering with thin films of the rainbow. Metallic reflections are replaced by red tones. Everything here is red. Fine dust penetrates the skin, paints the hands, face, and soaks all clothes. All the roads are red, the houses are red. A heap of ore fines protrudes into the sea with a red tongue, and brown-yellow waters seem to encircle the red shore, marking the area of transformation of iron luster into iron oxide hydrates. Here I made friends with the workers. They collected the best samples for me, gave me wine from their vineyards, and were proud of their friendship with the Rosso, who told them about the great Russian country in broken Italian. But my main assistants were the guys. A whole army of bambinos ran to me. I showed them what crystals I needed. They, like nimble animals, instantly scattered around the mine. And an hour later a whole pile of crystals was already growing around me. For the best of them, a bonus was paid in copper soldi. Such preparations lasted several days. Excellent crystals and druses are carefully placed in the backpack. The boys see me off with wild exclamations, and Il Papa drives his white horse, also already covered with irregular red spots of iron sheen. Alas, the money is running out. From 150 rubles collected over the winter, there is not much left. You have to give up an exciting trip on a fishing felucca to the island of Monte Cristo, which is not only known from the novel by A. Dumas, but is also famous for its beautiful minerals, including radioactive minerals, found in the voids of granite that forms this island. I hand over all my preparations to a special office, which is supposed to send everything to Heidelberg, and say goodbye to the hotel staff, who persistently called me l'illustre Francese, the famous Frenchman. A few more vivid pictures of Italy were imprinted on me on the way to the north. In a heavy postal mailpost, we climbed the town of Voltaire hanging on the rocks. There is a palace hotel, and an ancient fortress, and wonderful workshops for the processing of marble and alabaster. All this is a piece of the Middle Ages, so wonderfully described in many Italian novels. From here, through the desert Maremma with the lenses of snow-white alabaster, which laid the foundation for the famous art industry of Tuscany, I drove to the region of the Boron Sophians, where masses of steam and superheated water containing boric acid and its salts burst out of the ground. Here, the whole town of Lardarello was heated in winter by the hot waters of the bowels, and pure boric acid was boiled and crystallized in large vats. I drove through the town of Massa to the marble quarries of Carrara, on the southern slopes of the Apuan Alps. Carrara is one of the richest deposits of various types of marble in the world, especially white, called ordinario, and light yellowish, slightly translucent, very rare. Used for sculptural products or statuario. Here I saw how huge blocks of snow-white marble were brought down the mountain slopes on bulls. Then, through Genoa and Milan, I went home. I was so tired and so exhausted after a 3-month stay in the mountains that in Genoa, when they saw my clothes, they would not let me into the restaurant. I arrived in Heidelberg almost without a penny, and in the evening I only had enough strength to hang a sign outside the front door, announcing my return, to hang a bread bag and to put out a milk jug. The trip to Italy taught me a lot and, first of all, introduced me to the power of granite processes, to the remarkable formation of granite pegmatite veins. And since then, for almost 30 years of my life, I have been engaged in these educations. All my travels and expeditions were connected with them. They were one of the main topics of my scientific work. On the border of Mongolia. This was during the years of the First Imperialist War. I was still a young scientist, an inexperienced researcher of the Urals and the Crimea. In 1916, one spring day, the director of our scientific institute, Academician V.I. Vernadsky, summoned me and said, "The government has given me the task to search for aluminum ores on the territory of our country. Military science needs a large amount of this metal, and yet Russia not only does not mine a single gram of aluminum, but does not even know where to get it. I heard your report at the last scientific circle, when you spoke about probable deposits of aluminum ores. You developed the theory that they could be found in the basalt sheets of Mongolia, where the hot southern sun erodes these rocks and accumulates aluminum-rich red earths among the sands and steppes. Go to Mongolia, test your hypothesis, discover aluminum ores for us. And this will not only be a gift to our country, but also the beginning of your scientific career. Less than 3 days later, I was already sitting in the Siberian Express, forgetting to take the necessary literature, maps and even equipment with me. I was rather eager to see the scorching sun of Central Asia, to those countries whose descriptions I read in several fantastic stories by Sven Gedin, in the exact exposition of N.M. Przewalski and in the poetic pictures of his companion, P.K. Kozlov. But I forgot about the precepts that these great explorers of the heart of Asia left us. I forgot that there are no postal routes, along which a paper signed by the Tsarist Minister of Internal Affairs opened up unlimited opportunities to receive a troika for each haul at 3 kopecks per verst and a horse. I forgot that there is not at every step a cozy, albeit dirty, Italian trattoria, nor a German cough or an elegant jewel of Czechoslovak villages. The journey ahead seemed simple, clear, and obvious, and the Siberian Express carried me away, carefree, rocking me to the steady rhythm of a comfortable carriage. Here is Verkhnedinska steamer with a huge wheel at the stern, raising the foam of the Selinga, the mournful singing of a sailor at the bow, measuring the depth with the futrid, endless shoals, deserted shores, abandoned Ulysses. Here is Ust-Kyokta, a fine postal troika took me along a dusty road to the border town of Troitskosavsk, the well-known Kyokta, an old pass point for carts with Chinese tea. From here my journey to the upper reaches of the Kilka-Chikoya, Chikona rivers, on the very border with Mongolia, should begin. I was advised to invite a guide, an experienced Transbaikal Cossack, a good guy Larian, to take 2 replacement horses, a revolver just in case, and to wear a uniform cap. Armed with all this, we set off. In the Trinity Sava Museum, I managed to skim through literature and maps, wrote down and sketched something. But I had more hope for a Cossack who knew the Buryat and Mongolian dialects well, and had been to those places more than once. And so my wandering began. I will not tell you how many stupid things I did then, both as a traveler and as an explorer. Near the abandoned Ulas, hungry wolves rushed at our horses. I took them for dogs and tried to get off with a whip, and only the energetic intervention of the Cossack saved our horses, and perhaps us. Tired of hunting and procuring food, I had little time to write down anything in my notebook. The maps I captured turned out to be old, rough schemes that did not correspond to the landscape at all, and nature. The enchanting nature of Selinga Doria, full of contradictions, fascinated me so much that I did not want to think, write, or even look for the red earth. On our way we met either cold, full-flowing rivers, or turbulent rapids rushing from the bald, raging streams, or quiet, calm meadows along the banks of peacefully flowing rivers. Everything is mixed up in this land. Here one could see pictures reminiscent of the southern, sun-drenched Ukraine, where, instead of corn, the fields of Golyang rose just as high, and pictures like our polar north with its permafrost. It was enough to look into any well, to look at a fresh cliff in the river, in order to notice white stripes of solid ice everywhere at a depth of several meters. And along with this, there is a completely exhausting heat. During the day, the naked bronze bodies of the Mongols. At night, the inevitable warm sheepskin coats, elegant kokoshniks of the semi-ski and escaped convicts hiding in abandoned dugouts. All these new impressions dulled the memory of the past, of the institute, and even of science, involuntarily forced you to merge with nature, and you began to lead some kind of plant life. Gradually, step by step, we began to climb to the upper reaches of the Chikoy. The settlements of the semi-ski became less and less frequent. Some Ulysses were abandoned. The forests of the southern taiga were closed in front of us by a solid wall. Meanwhile, the red stone of aluminum ore was not given to us. Some basalt covers were devoid of red soil. The protruding light granites on the chars sparkled with shiny crystals of mica. White and pink marbles formed whole rocks on the banks of the rivers, but there was no red earth. My assumption was not confirmed. It seemed to me that we should go even further south, where the sun is even brighter, where the black basalts are even more destroyed, and there, at last, we will find our aluminum ore. I persistently directed our way to the south, not noticing that we had long since gone beyond the limits of the maps I had taken. That Larian had long ceased to understand rivers, valleys and podushkas, in short, that we were walking at random. This did not last long. Very soon I realized that there was no red earth, that we were already running out of ammunition, that the horses were tired, and we, in fact, did not know where we were. I decided to turn, but, as always happens, we were unlucky. Bad weather began. The sky was covered with clouds. The sun was not visible. In vain we tried to orient ourselves by tree trunks. Burnt stumps. In the end, we lost our direction completely. Food was running out. The horses were completely exhausted, and we walked forward in silence in search of the north. How many times did a single horse track seem to show us the way? But it was immediately lost in the quagmire or at the crossing, and we were again left alone in the boundless taiga. I remember how now, one foggy morning, we got up after a rather restless night, made a fire and drank tea with small pieces of the last sugar. Larian and I were thinking about where we should go, and did not notice at all how a man suddenly appeared by our fire. He squatted, warmed his chilled hands and looked with surprise at the Cossack, then at me. We started talking. He was going to the Autumn Moon Festival in the big Gizhnuzerski Datsun monastery. He is one of the novices of this Lamite monastery. He will soon be a great Lama, as he already knows how to read old books and sing old songs. He knows the whole neighborhood well. It turned out that we had wandered very far. The railway is not less than 200 versts away, but very close, only 60 versts away. There is the Russian resort of Yomarovka. There are real Russians, and they even brought there on 6 horses, such a machine that when you poke your finger at it, it begins to play better than the seashells that are played in the Gizhnuzerski Datsun. He suggested that we get on the horses, and he would go with us to the nearest hill and from there show us the way to Yomarovka. We were extremely happy. They quickly saddled their horses, laid down their small luggage with a few samples of minerals and rocks, and cheerfully climbed the nearest bare hill. The wide, boundless picture of the forests was drowning in the blue of the foggy morning. Ridge after ridge alternated with separate curtains. Here and there strips of rivers glittered. In the distance, to the left, a lonely smoke spoke of housing, and our Yomarovka was somewhere there, closer to sunrise, beyond the 5th ridge. Listen carefully, said the young Buriat. You will go down from this mountain to this Badushka to the left. There will be a good ford. You will pass through the swamp, go around that lonely mountain with char and run into a turbulent foaming river. Go up it as you come to a bare place, cross it, pass over the ridge, and you will get to a large full-flowing river. This will be Chika. Go down the left bank, and after a one-day hike you will see a wheeled road. It leads to Yomarovka. I must say that these explanations did not satisfy me. I knew perfectly well that it was enough for us to make one small mistake, and the whole plan, so precisely drawn, would turn out to be a mirage. I asked Larian to tell the young Buriat that we were afraid of getting lost, that our horses were tired, and we asked him to accompany us to the beginning of the road that leads to Yomarovka. But the Buriat objected. He said that in 3 days there would be a young moon, that in his Datsun the young moon would be greeted with a procession in terrible masks, expelling evil spirits from a person, that he must be there and that he had better repeat his story once again. Now listen, he said. You're coming down that mountain, into this valley to the left. There'll be, but I did not allow him to finish, interrupted him and asked Larian to tell him more insistently that we were exhausted, that we did not know the signs here, that we could not find the way ourselves, and that he must go with us. After all, In the evening, he will lead us to the big-wheeled road and we will be able to let him go." The Buriat did not agree. He told the Cossack for a long time about the celebrations of the first autumn moon that awaited him in the Gizniuzerski Datsun. He said that he could not lose a day, and suddenly breaking off the conversation, he turned his horse sharply, hoping to quickly disappear into the thicket of the forest. Noticing this maneuver, I demanded that he stop. It didn't work. Then I decided to take a step that now seems completely incomprehensible to me. I snatched a revolver, from which, I confess, I had never fired in my life, pointed it at the Buriat, and said in a stern voice to Larian, "Tell him to stop immediately, he must show us the way." The Buriat hesitated, stopped his horse and timidly rode up to us. And we went together. They drill ahead, askance, looking at us with disbelief. Behind him, I was with a revolver in my hand, now lowering my hand, now waving it ridiculously, as if to frighten some unknown enemies. Larian rode silently behind me. We crossed the Podushka, reached a foaming stream, stopped at the pass, on which there was a large oboe with rags on the branches, indicating that this place was sacred. We made a halt, drank tea. The Buriat all the time looked askance at my gun, which was lying next to me on the grass. And so the day passed. I don't know what to call it, tragic or comic. It was as if we were talking merrily to each other, and the Buriats were singing merry songs, which Larian translated for me. Now he sang about me, a great Russian official, who came to his land to build railways in it and interfere with the grazing of peaceful herds. He sang about the struggle with the Mangadae, who had either 108 or 1008 heads, and it even seemed to me that sometimes I was one of these Mangadaes who prevented him, the future Lama, from doing his sacred work. He sang mournfully, singing to the rhythm of his horse's step, then suddenly shouting some incantations loudly, apparently when he managed to cut off one of the heads of a terrible monster or defeat it. But in the midst of these exclamations, he suddenly stopped his horse abruptly, quickly turned it to the right, and in a green meadow, on the edge of a large river, I saw the track of a wheel. "Here it is, the big road to Yomarovka. You have 1 day's journey left from here now." He looked at me inquiringly. I hid my gun in my holster and thereby made it clear that now everything was over. We said goodbye to our guide in a friendly way. Exhausted by this unusual day, they quickly unsaddled their horses, put saddles under their heads and fell asleep with the sleep of a man who had finally found a way out of a difficult misfortune. Yes, we got out of trouble. The next day, still following the flow of the turbulent Chikoya River, we reached the resort of Yomarovka, where we were met and caressed by a doctor. And soon in the large dining room we saw the car that the Buriat had told us about. It was a piano that had been transported over the ridges from the Kilok station in winter. With great difficulty, a year has passed. The red stone aluminum ore was not found, but I did not give up on my idea. Obviously, it must be sought further east, somewhere in northern Manchuria. And here again the Siberian Express takes me to distant Siberia for the same red stone. At the Kilok station, I got out of the car on the platform to get some fresh air. In one of the cars, the axle box caught fire, and it was possible to have time to climb the hill and look at the boundless forest ocean of the taiga in which I had wandered so unsuccessfully last year. When I was returning to the station, some unknown Buriat rushed to me. He was dressed in a brown Lamite robe with wide yellow stripes, with a yellow Lama cap on his head. I did not notice how in a few seconds I was wrapped in the sleeves of my dressing gown, and found myself in the tender embrace of the Buriat, who was kissing me. For a long time I could not understand that happened, and even at first he did not recognize in Buriat his forced guide of last year's trip. He gently shook my hand and quickly spoke to me some incomprehensible words in the Buriat language. Fortunately, A railway employee who knew the Buryat language was standing nearby. He translated for me the story of a young Buryat who recalled our meeting last year in the Chikoy taiga. I was embarrassed and amazed by his attitude towards me. "Ask him," I said to the railroad man. "Isn't he angry with me, for I almost killed him?" "No," replied the Buryat. "You did the right thing. If I were you, I would do the same." And this awareness of the correctness of my step, perhaps even a certain pride in meeting a man who turned out to be as resolute as he was, brought us closer together. Then for many years, we met with him at a large joint work on the creation of a new Baryasha. When the brown and yellow striped Lamite robes were thrown off, and the new, literate youth, forgetting the terrible faces of the masks, participants in the festive processions in the Datsans, joined the common work to raise the productive forces of the beautiful Buryat country. But the lesson that I learned then in one of my first large expeditions, I remembered for the rest of my life. I realized that I myself was to blame for the poor organization of the expedition, that it was only by chance that I managed to get out of trouble myself, and not involve others in the trouble, that I deserved the words of reproach with which my teachers and leaders at the academy greeted me. On my return from the expedition, I learned to be smart, and since then preparing for an expedition has become one of the most important moments in my job. At the same time, I always remembered the wonderful words of Amundsen, who said that an expedition is a preparation. And for years I prepared for a journey that sometimes lasted only a few months. And when he once abandoned this basic principle of his life, in an effort to help the dying Italy, flew by plane to the North Pole without preparation, he found death. What a tragic proof of one's rightness, and confirmation of the enormous role of preparatory work in expeditions. The Urals. Introduction. Exactly a quarter of a century has passed since I went to the Urals for the first time. As a young assistant. Not so many years, but so many events. And over the past 25 years, the Urals have given a lot of new things. Many times during this time I had to wander around the Urals, from its northern taiga ranges to its spurs in the feather grass steppes of Kazakhstan. Many new works have been started during this time, but few of them have been completed. Ural mineralogy has not yet been written. A number of major scientific problems remained unresolved. We should all consider ourselves indebted to the Urals, this world pearl of the mineral kingdom. After all, we should not forget that real scientific mineralogy was born in the Urals. If in the 18th century the first accurate taxonomy of stones and their external description was given by a galaxy of Swedish scientists, Linnaeus, Valerius, Bromell, Cronstedt, then the beginning of accurate descriptive mineralogy was laid only here, in Russia. When first Academician Kupfer first described the crystallization of tourmalines, and then N.I. Koksharov for almost half a century in his famous Mineralogy of Russia gave the main exact constants of mineral species. Quantitative mineralogy and crystallography were born in the Urals, and when Academician Koksharov, General Gadolin and Prince Kachubi gathered in the cozy memorial offices, their conversations, which lasted long after midnight, concerned only stone, the stone of the Urals. Everyone boasted of new acquisitions, showed the results of new measurements. A deviation of angles of 10 minutes was already either a mistake or a great achievement. Gadolin, with his mathematical mind, brought accuracy to all calculations. Kachubi, with artistic flair, selected pieces of rare beauty, and Koksharov, with all the importance of his bulky figure, simply took away good crystals from the guests who came to him, hid them in his desk, and then added them to his personal collection. Conversations were interrupted by a card game. It was not money that was lost, but stones. Beautiful stuffs passed from the Koksharov collection to the Kachubi collection. On these evenings, notes were compiled for the notes of the Mineralogical Society. Kachubi talked about L.A. Perovsky, about his famous collection, which he bought from Perovsky for a song, about the boy Pomykin, who was sheltered for emeralds by Count Perovsky and who later became a millionaire in the Urals. And in spite of this peculiar situation, the exact figures of our mineralogy were gradually becoming clear. Knowledge about the Ural stone was gradually accumulated. The richest places of topaz, Euclase, beryl, chrysoberyl, Sanaka and Kamenka turned into Ural Brazil. Koksharov's students at the Mining Institute sent him all the best samples, all the best crystals from the Ural factories. Academician P.V. Arameev, a student and follower of Koksharov, continued his work. And again, the Ural mineral was the basis of research. In 1891, the last, 11th volume of Mineralogy of Russia was published. Since then, no one has been able to supplement or deepen this best summary of the minerals of our Union. And now we can only say with bitterness that this summary was printed in German, that its best pages date back to the 60s of the last century. Yes, undoubtedly, we, mineralogists, are indebted to the Urals and should remember this. 25 years of work in the Urals cover two completely different periods. The pre-war, pre-reform, state-owned Urals and the new Urals, with its socialist construction and a huge reversal of mining enterprises. The symbol of the old Urals was the famous White House on the shore of the Isetsky Pond in Yekaterinburg, where the head of the Ural state factories, a kind of governor-general of the entire Urals, lived. The wonderful pages of Mamin Sibiryuk's works tell us about this old Ural with its drunken revelry, mad gold, dashing troikas and wild hit in the Tiger. I had only a slight encounter with this old Urals, when for the first time in 1912 I received a business trip from the Academy of Sciences, and 150 rubles for the trip. We dragged ourselves slowly by cheap train in order to begin our wanderings from Ekaterinburg, now Sverdlovsk. Yekaterinburg was a real city of stone. The entire street from the station to the city was occupied by lapidary workshops, and emerald was cut in huge quantities in them. But the most remarkable thing was that all this emerald was stolen, for according to the agreement, all the emerald mines were given to the French company, and legally not a single stone could enter the free market. And nevertheless, the whole of Yekaterinburg sold, bought, cut, faked, painted and sold the Ural emerald again. Certain years gave the city, as Yekaterinburg was called in the Urals, with remarkable riches. Now a cartload of green beryl, then whole pounds of bright, green chrysolite demantoid, then, finally, whole buckets of light blue aquamarines from Sherlovaya Mountain came here. Yekaterinburg lived in the interests of the stone, collecting, selling, buying, substitutions and falsification. At the bazaar, stone was sold in separate shops. On different streets we had our acquaintances, old sellers of good stone. There were also the owners of individual kapushkas, who organized kompanstvo for the extraction of stone on the Duya. There were also ordinary sellers who bought minerals from peasants who came from the villages, ordering them poob material for collections. There were organized offices for the sale of minerals not only to museums in Russia, but also to foreign ones. Every self-respecting engineer had to collect minerals. For many decades, marvelous mineralogical collections were collected in this way, most of which eventually ended up in the Mineralogical Museum of the Academy of Sciences, or the Museum of Mining Institutes, and on the ground, with different kapushkas, in different areas of the Urals. Their own miners were scattered, stone seekers, seekers of happiness. Some of them put all their soul, energy and strength into the extraction of stone. But this did not give them income, and for a pittance, they sold the stone to others. And these others bought individual crystals and stuffs, sold them to the city, played them at cards. And a long story can be told about the past of each large crystal of beryl or topaz from Mazinka. There, in the villages, a new generation of lovers of easy money was created. Crystals of beautiful red monazite from the Ilmen Mountains were glued into Mazinka's pegmatite stuff, and woe to my inexperience. Once I triumphantly brought such a stuff to St. Petersburg, and was ridiculed by connoisseurs of the Ural stone. Good crystals of light beryl were covered with bright green varnish. I had no idea then that you just need to take such a crystal in your teeth. The varnish will crunch and betray its nature. But the fakes reached a rare virtuosity. The gold was so wonderfully inserted into the voids of Berzov's gold-bearing quartz, and the crystal of red crocoit was attached to the piece with gold, that even experienced connoisseurs of Berzov's minerals could not distinguish a fake. Large crystals of emeralds were sewn. The middle was hollowed out. The crystal was filled with a green chromium liquid. Then both halves were glued together. The place of gluing was very cleverly covered with plates of real emerald slate. The wondrous emerald crystal of many thousands was ready. One of the best connoisseurs of the Ural stone proudly took it to the French for sale. He was caught, and the French were also caught. Such was the atmosphere of old Ekaterinburg. And when we arrived there, it took many days to go around all the stone cellars, to inspect the collections, to admire the wonderful collection of herri that one of the richest people of Yekaterinburg collected, to admire the novelties and new arrivals that appear every year in separate collections. Everyone burned out on the stone, and nevertheless it was impossible to free oneself from the love of stone. And we were infected with this passion and also mysteriously whispered in front of each new crystal, admiring some new facet. I whispered to my companions to buy them for our museum, while my companions, knowing full well that any increased interest would immediately raise the price not only to the red, but also to the Kotenka, tried in vain to hide my delight, stubbornly talked to the seller about the harvest and drank tea with him for a long time. But we examined everything in Yekaterinburg. Most of the money given to us by the Museum of the Academy of Sciences for purchases has been spent, and we order a troika. Early in the morning, a large box filled with hay with 3 beautiful horses harnessed to it drives up to the porch of our house. Bales and equipment are tied to the shivering behind with strong ropes, and we roll to Mazinka, as much as 120 kilometers away. But the word Katim does not quite fit here. Our 3 are still flying along the stone pavement of the city with noise and incredible shaking. But when we go beyond the railway to the big Alipivsky tract, we immediately find ourselves at the mercy of the road. I think that now few people know what the old Ural road is. Potholes, dives, deep ruts, stumps, the remains of old elves, tree roots, stones, rocks, fragments of some old pavements. This is a brief enumeration of those components from which the Ural road was composed. After a week of Ural rains, the potsherds turned into lakes, side ditches into seas. The mud was so deep that the trio could hardly pull out our box, and usually on the first day we managed to get only to the Baltum postal station, located about 25 kilometers from the city. Here is the usual change of horses and overnight stay. This is how our road to Shaitanka, Lipovka, Mazinka stretched. So the horses dragged us along the dirty turn to Revda, Neva, Shabra, Sidolnikovo. Even worse, perhaps, was the famous road to the emerald mines, on which it swayed and tossed like on a boat in stormy weather, and where the extraordinary strength of the Ural box competed with the hardness of stumps and huge stones. Now all this is in the past, and in place of the old dirty state-owned Urals, something completely new is growing at Urals that our whole country is rightfully proud of. The past of the Ilmen Mountains. Who among the mineralogists and nature lovers has not heard of the Ilmen Mountains? Any textbook of mineralogy speaks of them, listing a number of the rarest minerals or noting the beauty of the pale blue Amazonian stone. Who among the mineralogists does not dream of visiting this mineralogical paradise? the only one on Earth in terms of the richness, diversity and originality of its fossils. At the end of the Zviye century, brave Cossacks penetrated here at the end of the Zviye century. Here the Cossack Prutov was looking for gems and mica for windows. But it was alarming and difficult to establish development and extract these stones here. Brave travelers also penetrated here with no less difficulty. First the Beck merchant Menge 1825, who discovered here a variety of minerals that had not yet been seen in the West, and later the companion of the famous traveler and geographer Alexander Humboldt, Gustav Rose 1829, who was the first to give an excellent description of this mineralogical region. But the heavy mountain roads and dusty long highways have now been replaced by the Great Siberian Railway. At the very foot of the Ilmen mountain, on the shore of Lake Ilmen, there is a small Mayas station, built of beautiful greyish stone, resembling granite in appearance. But in fact, it is a rare rock named after Mayas, Mayaskite. A steep wooded slope rises immediately behind the station, and behind the small station village surrounding it. From here, from the south, Ilmenskaya mountain seems to be a separate mountain peak. But this is only a trick of the eye. It is only the southern end of a long chain of mountains, a whole, almost uninterrupted range. It stretches far to the north and for more than 100 kilometers retains its peculiar shape and a number of features of chemical composition. In the west, it is bordered by a wide valley of the Mayas River with large gardens, sparse forests, and arable land in the east. At first, a slightly hilly, forested landscape with sparkling winding lakes, and then the boundless steppes of western Siberia. In 3/4 of an hour, you can climb the steep slope of the Ilmen mountain to its top, and from individual rocky ridges, a beautiful, unforgettable picture spreads in all directions. At the foot of the station house, there is a ribbon of the South Ural Railway, a small sparkling lake, behind it another, a third. The hilly soft contours of the mountains completely fill the horizon in the south, separating the wide valley of the Mayas from the mountainous west. Here, through binoculars, you can distinguish Lake Alanchik in the south to the west. On the bare granite slopes of the Chashkovsky Mountains, you can see the city of Mayas with a long pond stretching into the distance. Still further to the south, there are wide lowlands with the ribbon of the Urals highway, with jasper deposits, gold-bearing places and veins, with excellent deposits of talc. To the left, far on the edge of the horizon, behind the birch copses, the famous cocker places with pink-purple topazes, pale green or bluish euchrises, and other rare stones are hidden in the foggy distance, which made up the glory of Russian Brazil, as the famous Russian mineralogist N.I. Koksharov called this region in the middle of the 6th century. The picture is much more grandiose in the west. Here the long chains of the Ural range stretch like a solid wall and sink in the fog in the south. There is a whole panorama of mountains, sometimes covered with dense forests, sometimes inhospitably bare, completely littered with fragments of rocks. The bare rocky Alexandrovskaya hill, near which the railway winds, the beautiful Taganay with huge screes of yellow and reddish aventurine, the mountain that gave the Russian lapidaries the only sparkling material in the world for decorative crafts. Further on Yerma and other peaks of the main Ural range, sometimes completely bare and wild, sometimes covered with virgin forests. In 1834, the engineer Anosov figuratively described this formidable Urals. Its nature in these places is wild and gloomy. Majestic forests, not yet exterminated, transparent streams of water, noisily running along their steep rocky bottoms, solitary mountain lakes pour. Here and there scattered yurts of semi-settled Bashkirs, their uncultivated fields and, finally, wild, perpendicular heaving hills. The wide lowland of the Mayas separates the Ilmen Mountains from the main Ural range. Only in the north is this border less sharp. where a heavy cloud of smoke and sulfur dioxide emitted by the Karabakh copper smelter in the city of Kishtim rises to the sky. But most of all, we mineralogists should be attracted by the view to the east and not to the foggy expanse of the boundless Siberian plain that stretches beyond Chebarkal and Chelyabinsk. No, but to what is here, directly below, at the very foot of the eastern slopes of the Ilmen Range, where winding lakes sparkle among the soft, hilly landscape of wooded terrain. A large clearing separates the slopes of Ilmenskaya mountain from these forests. But this is not a clearing, but a swampy lake completely filled with peat. In the forests themselves, crossed by regular cutting areas, the famous mines of gems and colored stones are hidden, the famous topazes and aquamarines of the Ilmen Mountains. End of the first part. Part 1. Listen to the rest of this story on our channel. Also on our channel, you will find many other stories about expeditions and discoveries. Please subscribe and like our videos so that other people can know about them. Thank you very much. We work for you.